I think training for muscle growth takes the most effort physically, but probably takes the least effort mentally. Like, it is very forgiving in terms of the range of training variables that can work, as long as the training itself is hard and of adequate volume.
Welcome to the Train with Zan podcast,
where our goal is to help you look, feel, and perform like an athlete.
In each episode, we're interviewing experts in training, nutrition, and sports performance
who will help you separate fact from fiction in the fitness industry.
Now, here's your host, a former professional athlete,
certified personal trainer, and nutrition coach,
Zan Barksdale.
Welcome back to the Train with Zan podcast. My name is Zan Barksdale. I'm your host. Really excited to share today's episode with you. A couple of weeks ago, we had Eric Trexler on, who's part of Stronger by Science. If you remember him, we talked all about supplements. And today we have the other half of the Stronger by Science podcast, Greg Nuckols. He's written a tremendous number of articles. He's very well known and well respected in the scientific and evidence-based community around training and nutrition. And he's got some really good information for you in today's episode. All of the notes and links and timestamps can be found on the website at trainwithzan.com/007. This is episode number 7. So you can find it at trainwithzan.com/007. And while you're there on the website, go ahead and be sure to enter your email address so that you get the updates when new episodes are released and also when I release new articles and videos. With that said, let's go ahead and jump right into today's episode.
Let's get this party started in 3, 2, 1.
Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode. Really excited about today's guest. We have someone who recently successfully defended their thesis at North Carolina Chapel Hill. Very smart guy, but he also is a strong guy as well. He's held 3 all-time powerlifting world records in the 220 and 242 pound weight classes. He's written for basically all of the major fitness magazines out there, the ones you know, like Men's Health, Men's Fitness, Muscle and Fitness, along with many others. He also writes full-time for his own website, strongerbyscience.com, where he writes, I guess we could call them articles, but they're very in-depth, very thorough. Some of these articles could probably be turned into books. And he also has recently started his own podcast at strongerbyscience.com. I want to congratulate him on that and speak about that in a little while. And he also writes for another publication called MASS, which is an acronym for Monthly Application in Strength Sport. I'm personally a lifetime member, so this is not a plugged, not an advertisement, but it's an awesome resource that we'll talk about a little bit more later. But I'd like to welcome to the show Greg Nuckols.
Thanks for having me on.
Greg, thanks for being here. Really excited. For the people at home who are listening, you are known in the fitness circle or the evidence-based circle as one of the smartest guys out there who is able to very clearly convey advanced or extremely difficult topics very clearly to a lot of people. And that's one of the things I like about your monthly MASS subscription so much. You guys will look at a number of different scientific articles that come out every single month, and you'll break them down. You'll kind of evaluate them so that common people like me can understand them. So definitely appreciate what you do with that, and you do a phenomenal job at Stronger by Science as well. But definitely glad to have you here. And what I'd kind of like to do is I'd kind of like to give my listeners an introduction to you and to what you do and kind of how you got into this evidence-based community.
Sure. So, played a bunch of sports growing up. Eventually got too injured in various ways to play real sports anymore. At the time, probably my main sport was basketball. But the thing that eventually knocked me out of sports was really bad concussion issues playing football. But I had a trainer for the time for basketball because I'm like 5'10" on a good day, more like 5'9" and a half. But I could jump really well, and I could dunk, but only if I had like a really solid alley-oop, and my hands are too small to palm the ball. So like the main reason I started working out was I wanted to get like another 3 to 4 inches on my vertical. So like if I was on a fast break, I could throw down very convincingly with 2 hands. Like that was the only thing I wanted to get out of my training.
Well, that's what every high school player wants, right? I mean,
Yeah,
really.
yeah, for sure. So I can say that I've dunked, but I have like maybe a half dozen solid dunks to my name of all time. But like whatever, like I cleared that hurdle. Life is good.
Hey, what? Well, that's half a dozen more than me, so you're doing pretty well.
So once I got knocked out of like real sports, the guy who'd been training me to get my vertical up, Travis Mash, he was a power lifter. Now he coaches mostly Olympic weightlifting. But at the time, he was one of the best power lifters in the world. And he was like, "Well, this isn't the worst thing that could have happened to you. You're better at lifting than you were at sports in the first place. So why don't you give powerlifting a shot?" That seemed good to me. Biggest thing is I needed a sport where I could, take out my competitive passions, but also have minimal risk of head trauma. And powerlifting is good for that because if you sustain head trauma powerlifting, you did something very wrong.
You missed the
Um,
lift. You definitely didn't hit the lift if you get a concussion, I'd say.
yeah, yeah. So yeah, started powerlifting, really, really took to it. I enjoyed everything about the sport and I was just naturally good at it. So, those things worked well together. Um, Coming out of high school, I like what I wanted to do is be a personal trainer. I just thought that seemed like a great life. My parents were like, no, that's absolutely not what you're going to do. Um, they absolutely meant well. They had like pushed my brother and I very hard academically, and they're like, "Look, you got good grades. Like, try to be like a doctor, lawyer, professor, something, and then like maybe save that as like a backup plan if everything falls through." And it's like, okay, okay, sure. Like, I'll give it a shot. So I went into college as a history major, with a plan of maybe becoming a professor one day. And then when I learned like what the actual job description of a history professor looks like, I was like, nope, don't want anything to do with that. So when I got to the senior capstone class for history, and made that realization, I was, how family friendly is this podcast?
It's as family friendly as you'd like for it to be.
Okay. So when I got to the senior capstone class, I was just like, fuck this. Like, I don't want anything to do with this life. So against probably my parents' wishes, I transitioned to exercise science. Um, what I'm currently doing now, I didn't even know was a possible job description. It was just like, well, I have a few more years left on the scholarship. If I'm going to be a trainer, I may as well like learn some things in school about that. And like at that point, I'd been powerlifting for like 7 or 8 years. I was very obsessed with it. And so like anything that I could learn that could possibly help me be a better powerlifter, and like I was already training some people at the time, so anything that I could learn to help me be a better coach, I was all about it. So that's what kind of got my pinky toe in the scientific side of things. And then graduated. Uh, my wife got an internship out in California. I'm from North Carolina originally. And she was only guaranteed, I believe, 12 weeks on the front end, maybe 16. But it was the type of deal where I couldn't very well just like roll up to a Gold's Gym and be like, "Hey, I might be gone in 3 months, but give me a job anyways."
Mm.
So I was very lucky to get a gig as the content manager for Juggernaut Fitness Systems or Juggernaut Training Systems. Um, and so that kind of got me into the, I guess, like content side of the fitness industry. And I was still coaching a lot of people as well. But that gave me a lot of time to like when I wasn't editing other people's articles. So like one, just editing other people's articles from other folks who really knew what they were talking about. Like Chad Wesley Smith was really, really good at recruiting good authors for Juggernaut. So that exposed me to a lot of new ideas. And then, I was working on my computer for the most part. So I had a ton of time to just like try to learn more stuff. And, there's so I think the most common definition of knowledge, of actually knowing something, is something being a justified true belief. And so, like I also took like a bunch of philosophy and like epistemology classes in college because I'm a nerd. And so like, I wanted to know things about lifting. So, one, you want a reliable process to identify true beliefs. And two, you want to make sure you have adequate justification for what you believe. So knowledge being justified true beliefs, like those are the two necessary preconditions. And so kind of what I settled on to get to a point where I feel comfortable saying I know something is like when there's both scientific evidence to back it up, and there's also at least like a moderate amount of anecdotal evidence to back it up as well. So like, you see it working in the real world. You also see it working in the lab under controlled conditions. Okay, that's probably adequate justification to say that you know something. So I just wanted to know as much as I could about lifting. And so, that entailed both like training a lot, coaching a lot of people, reading what other like successful lifters and coaches were saying for like the anecdotal side of things. And then also just spending a ton of time in the research to see like which of these anecdotal observations also have research to back them up. So then I could say like, oh, these are justified true beliefs. I now know this about lifting. So yeah, just kind of being like really annoyingly epistemologically rigid necessitated me getting into the evidence-based side of things.
Well, I think it's awesome. And you've taken something that you wanted to learn more about, you're passionate about, and you go out and you look for different places to learn about it, but you also apply, philosophy and other aspects or other disciplines towards that. Like for me personally, I'm super into this stuff, but I like to read a lot of business books. I'm really into I've read a lot of psychology books, and that was one of the reasons I was interested in having you on, is because I knew you have some other interests, and you've drawn some of your ideas, from studying other areas, not just sitting in a lab and studying guys, pushing up heavy weights all day. You've got some other things and some other ideas to back it up and help you formulate your opinions.
Yeah, I try to be well-rounded enough that I can be interesting at parties.
There you go. And that's what everybody really wants.
Yeah.
So, well, really cool. It's cool how you got into it. Like I said, it definitely shows that you enjoy your work with what you do and how you've grown your presence online, and the success of Stronger by Science and Mass and your podcast. So let's talk about that briefly. Like I said, I'm a big fan of all your work. I'd said earlier, I'm a lifetime subscription holder to Mass. I also have read a lot of your articles, listened to your first podcast that came out a few weeks ago. Man, how do you find time to get all this stuff on paper and get all these thoughts out of your head? Because you're a pretty busy dude.
Well, you're talking to me on the back end of an all-nighter, so that's one hint.
Well, I hope you had some caffeine before you got on the show.
I'm chewing a reasonably large amount of nicotine gum right now, so it's keeping me going.
There you go.
Yeah, I mean, I wish I could give a good answer that's like, oh, you need to prioritize your time better and blah blah blah. But like, I mean, the realistic answer is I work more than I probably should. So the good thing is I really, really like what I do, so it doesn't feel like work. So like if I have downtime, kind of what I would like to do is work because I really, really enjoy what I do.
So there's nothing better than that, in my opinion. If you that's the height and that's the epitome, and that's, to me, that's a lot of happiness, is just being able to enjoy what you do.
Yeah, so that's, if there is a secret to my productivity, it's probably that. It's like I work obsessively on stuff because it's what I would typically prefer to be doing.
Sure. Well, that's awesome. Well, we've talked a lot about, kind of what you do. Let's talk a little bit more about some of the specifics of it, maybe. So what I've done is, just for all the listeners at home, is I've kind of gone through a lot of Greg's articles, and I've picked out some things, or some topics that I thought were interesting, and I just wanted to bring them up and get your thoughts on them. One of the things that I thought was very interesting, you had an article in Mass not too long ago about about individualization. And I think individualization is a very interesting topic because it seems like it makes sense from an outside perspective that, yeah, everybody should do things on an individual basis. You know, my program is going to be different than your program, is going to be different than somebody else's program, while we all have different goals and different, you know, slightly different anatomy and different features. But at the end of the day, you know, we're also the same species too. So how much variance does my diet need to have from your diet? You know, if somebody takes gluten out of their diet, is that going to revolutionize what they do versus, you know, somebody who gets on the keto diet, you know? So I'm just kind of curious about your thoughts about individualization, I guess from a training standpoint, but also from a nutritional standpoint as well.
Yeah, man. So, one of the things people will often say is like, oh, there doesn't need to be that much individualization. Like, we are obviously all the same species. We share like 99.99% of the same genes, etc. But it's also like we share something like 92% of the same genes with mice. And I think if you just like qualitatively assess like how different are humans from mice, you'd come up with a number considerably larger than 8%,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, I mean, there's a tremendous amount of like phenotypic variability between humans. One of my favorite pictures that's like surfaced in the past year is I'm blanking on the reporter's name, but there's a female reporter from ESPN taking a picture with Taco Fall from UCF,
Mm-hmm.
who's like 7'7", and like they look like just completely different things. Like
Right.
she's like
Yeah.
she's like 5'4", he's like 7'7", and it's like, yeah, like those are both humans, but like there are very large phenotypic differences between them. Or, you know, look at like Ronnie Coleman versus like Lance Armstrong. Like
Right.
elite athletes, not very comparable athletes. Um, so yeah, like there are some things where you're just dealing with like laws of physics. So for example, how much food people need to consume to manipulate their weight or to fuel their training, like that's very, very straightforward. And like there's some degree of variability there, but essentially like the exercise you do, you burn a fixed number of calories based on the amount of work you perform. There's some variability there based on how efficiently one moves, but for the most part, like, you know, you have your basal metabolic rate, which uh, is mostly determined by lean body mass, about 15% wiggle room, but I mean that's not a ton. And then just how much are you moving around throughout the day? How much do you exercise? Like you're dealing with laws of physics there. So there will be a lot of variability in how much people need to eat, but in terms of how much people need to eat relative to their body size and their activity level, there's actually not a ton of variability there. Like if you account for those other factors, like now you're dealing with the first law of thermodynamics, which is pretty solid.
Yeah.
Um,
Hard to argue that one, even though there are people out there that will.
True. But so like that's something where there's not a ton of variability, like once you account for those factors. Um, but then if you're dealing with an athlete in a sport like, I don't know, like take a basketball player, for example. Um, Now, if you're talking about like, do we need to individualize athletes' training programs for a sport like basketball? Absolutely, you do, because now you're dealing with, well, they need to have the wind to run up and down the court all game. They need to have a lot of lateral quickness, which a lot of athletes don't have unless they've specifically trained for it. And they just need to be really explosive. So ideally, they can play above the rim. And maybe an athlete walks through the door who is naturally incredibly explosive, but gets winded if they're on the court for 5 minutes. You have another athlete that walks through the door, they're just naturally in pretty good shape. Just practicing the sport is enough to keep them in good enough shape that they can play 30 hard minutes a game. But, you know, they have a subpar vertical. Now, if you're talking about, do we need to individualize those two athletes' programs? Absolutely, you do. Like, what would be ideal training for athlete A would be terrible training for athlete B and vice versa because they have different needs. And then if you get into like just variability in training responses, that's huge. So there was a seminal study by Hugh Ball and colleagues published in 2005, I believe. And they took like 500 plus completely untrained people and put them on a training program of just bicep curls, I believe 3 times a week, either 2 or 3 times per week. But like, decent training program. Like, you're dealing with untrained lifters. You should pretty much expect people to make progress. And the training program was the same for everyone.
Sure.
And the variability in responses was tremendous. So in terms of strength increases, there were some people who did not get stronger at all. And then the top responders, their 1 rep max doubled. And the average was, I think, like a 35% increase. Looking at hypertrophy, muscle growth, there were a couple individuals that actually had like very, very small decreases in bicep cross-sectional area, even though they were completely untrained going into it. And then the top responders, their biceps increased in cross-sectional area by more than 50%.
Wow.
And the average was like 18% or so. So like, yeah, there are some things where there's not much variability. So, calorie intake when accounting for body size and activity level, it's pretty predictable. Then you have to look at, well, the training programs we're assigning people based on what sport they're playing and based on just what their inherent strengths and weaknesses are. And then the actual magnitude of adaptations you can expect to see from people when you expose them to training. Ton of variability there. So yeah, it's hard to say there's just like one single answer for how much variability you should expect, because it kind of depends what domain you're talking about.
Yeah, there's definitely a spectrum, I think, for all those areas.
Yeah, and it also depends what like level of athlete you're coaching.
Absolutely.
So gym I used to coach at, we had like a lot of like youth athletes, but then we also had a fair amount of either like high school athletes who were probably going to go D1, or like maybe slip to D2, and then a fair amount of like D1 football players. And like at that point, you've already pre-selected for people who do respond well to training. Like otherwise they wouldn't be in that position.
Sure.
And so like there was quite a bit less variability in the responses we saw in those athletes compared to the youth athletes who, would be all over the genetic spectrum. Like some of them you could tell at 9 years old, like, yeah, you're going to be good at sports. And some of them, they're 12 years old and like, you don't want to tell them this, but they're probably always going to suck.
You just know.
Yeah. So, the amount of variability that you'll see in your coaching practice depends on the population of people you're working with, whether it's like Gen Pop or whether it's people who are already like pre-selected and specialized for a given sport.
Well, I think, a lot of interesting comments you made there. One of the comments that I read online a lot from a lot of different trainers, maybe it's guys that own gyms or guys that train people, they say we train all athletes, fast is fast, quick is quick, powerful is powerful, strong is strong. And they train all these athletes the exact same way. I mean, even in, they have one session or one summer program where, hey, if you're a defensive back, you can come train with us. If you're a shortstop or you're a center or whatever. And I just think like, man, there's a lot more to it than that. Like I get, yes, everybody wants to be strong. Everybody wants to be powerful and everybody needs to be, fast. But at the same time, like different sports have different demands and different requirements. And then different athletes and body types, people have different ceilings as well. So I'm all for individualizing it and making it as specific as we can.
Yeah, I mean, there's also kind of the question of like what sort of operation are you running and how much can you actually like feasibly individualize stuff. So, if
and to me that's the hardest area. I think that's the hardest problem.
Yeah, because at some point you are kind of trading off like how good of a job am I doing with each individual athlete for how profitable can my facility be? Because you can be quite profitable if you're doing like group training at a reasonably high rate and having groups of like 15 to 20 athletes like going out per session. But like, then unless you have a ton of coaches and you can like split out like very granular subsets of those athletes, like you can individualize some stuff, but for the most part, just to make that manageable, most people have to be doing basically the same type of stuff versus, something where you can still make a good living, but you're probably not going to be making just a crap ton of money, is just purely doing one-on-ones where you can individualize everything for that client. But again, you're probably leaving some money on the table. So, there's kind of that calculus you have to make, of like, am I going to specialize on individual athletes and like maybe work my way up such that the one-on-one clients I have are willing to pay me a lot of money, like eventually getting to that point? Or am I kind of going to go the more group coaching route where you individualize where you can, and maybe you try to make sure each group going out is kind of similar, so some of the individualization is accounted for there, but it's not going to be able to be as tailored for each athlete, but it's probably going to be more profitable for most people. So it just kind of depends what sort of business you're running.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, you talked about a few things there, and you kind of hinted around, specialization. Before we started recording, you told me you had a good story about early specialization, which in the baseball world is a hot topic. So I'd love to get your take on that and hear your story.
Yeah, I played AAU ball before there were pitch count rules.
Oh, nice.
And I also hit puberty like a brick wall when I was about 8. Um, so like if you've ever watched like the Little League World Series and you've seen like the kids who are almost exclusively pitchers, who you just look at them and you're like, they must have faked that kid's birth certificate. Like he has facial hair and he's allegedly 11 years old.
That was you.
That was me. And so, there were a couple teams that I was on that me on my 500th pitch of the weekend was still throwing better than our number 2 pitching option. And, it was like, people should have known better, but apparently they didn't know better. And like, I didn't know better. I was like 12. I was an idiot kid.
Not your responsibility at that age to know your pitch count and know how much pressure's on your elbow ligaments.
Yeah. And so like there would be times where I would pitch like 4 or 5 complete games back-to-back weekends for like a month and a half straight. And like, I loved it. That was great for me because like I liked pitching, but didn't really like any other part of baseball except for base running. Like I liked pitching and base running, and the rest of the sport
base running. Who likes base running?
Dude, base running's the best.
Oh man, that was the worst. So I played. I don't know my background. I played catcher. We had like courtesy runners growing up, so I never had to run the bases. So once I got like to college and I had to start running, it was like, God, this is for the birds, man. I had it backwards.
So I think the thing I like about most sports is being able to mess with people's heads. Mm-hmm. Because that's kind of like, it's the meta game on top of the actual game you're playing.
Absolutely.
And I mean, I'm like a 5'9.5" white dude. Like I had some physical tools, but I was definitely playing it against people who were better athletes than me in a lot of sports. And so I always liked the aspects of a sport where you could get in someone else's head. And so like, you can definitely do that as a pitcher, and you can definitely do that as a base runner. Cause like I would take just disgustingly fat leads off of first base, but like know exactly how far I could go and still get back without ever getting picked off. And like, it would just get in the pitcher's head so much. And it was so much fun. Like I loved that part of baseball, but anyway, so, going back to pitching. So, did that for about a year and a half. And then I went from, being able to comfortably throw like several hundred pitches in a weekend to go out, and by like the 3rd or 4th inning, my shoulder would be getting really, really inflamed. Like quite painful. Like I could still throw, but it hurt a lot. So we go to the doctor and I get an x-ray, and the doctor said, well, I see the problem. You have an issue with your labrum. And I said, well, what's the issue? And he said, for all intents and purposes, you don't have one anymore. Uh, so
So that's
yeah,
the issue. Yeah.
yeah. So for the rest of my life, my shoulder is bone on bone because I pitched way more than I should have at way too young of an age.
Yeah.
Um,
I think fortunately a lot of that, I'm not going to say it doesn't still happen because it definitely does, but I think a lot of that is being transitioned out with the new rules and the new pitch counts and just as much awareness as there is around it now. So that's a good thing.
yeah, I think that's great. I think that so I don't think anything that obvious is happening anymore. I do still think there's some huge issues with early specializations or early specialization. Can't talk. Early specialization. I mean, like you're hearing stories about high school kids already having Tommy John surgery, which was the type of thing that, like, yeah, I remember 15 years ago or so. I guess it was even longer, but like I remember when John Smoltz had his Tommy John surgery,
Mm-hmm.
and he'd been pitching for like 8 or 9 years already at that point, and they're like, "Oh man, like this is crazy. No one ever comes back from this." And like he eventually did, and went on to be a good closer. But like that was the type of thing where it was fairly rare, and if it did happen, it was for like hard throwing pitchers who'd been pitching professionally for like several years already, and occasionally you'd hear about it from like just a straight fireballer in college. And like now you're hearing about it pretty frequently at the collegiate level and also from high school kids. Like,
Greg, it's
and
even
I
younger than that. And
really,
even younger than that. And the crazy part of it is a lot of these people, they almost want to have it because you hear all the success stories, you know, as far as rehab has come and the return to play programs, they've gotten very good. And a lot of athletes do come back to 100%, and a lot of them come back, you know, beyond their previous 100%. And so a lot of these guys, they almost elect to have it. They want to have it because they think it's going to make them better and they're going to be stronger afterwards, and they won't have to worry about a second injury. And that's where a lot of bad information is just out on the internet or out in the world. And that's part of what I'm trying to do with this podcast and my website. And I know it's what you're trying to do, is just trying to, you know, spread good information. But yeah, absolutely. That's a real thing. And it happens to, I don't know the exact age who the youngest guy is, but I've heard of guys in the, you know, young teenage trying to have Tommy John.
that's outrageous. Now, one thing I will say, and hopefully this doesn't influence anyone in your audience in the wrong way. Uh, I've actually heard about that from like elite bench specialists, like bench press specialists.
Yeah.
So for people listening who don't follow powerlifting, we do squat, bench press, and deadlift. And then like the bench press itself is also contested as like a single lift. And so some people just focus on the bench press. And I've heard from some bench specialists that like you kind of want to tear a peg, because then when you like, and we're talking like a tendon rupture, because then you can get the tendon reattached a little bit further down your humerus. So you have a more favorable internal moment arm. So for like any given level of force of pectoral contraction, it creates like a larger like moment at your shoulder to actually like produce torque. Um, so is it like a similar logic with Tommy John surgery?
Similar logic. Yeah. Same idea.
Okay.
Basically think you're going to replace the original ligament with a stronger one, and you'll be better because of it. I tell you what, man, I love to lift and I love to bench as much as the next guy, but I don't want to tear my back, you know, with hopefully lifting a few more pounds.
And maybe this is just me being puritanical, but I feel like if you're a halfway insane 30-year-old bench specialist and you want to make that call for yourself, whatever, be my guest. You're like a 14-year-old kid. No, like you,
yeah,
like
big difference.
You're not in a place where you should be making that call, and like your parents shouldn't allow you to make that call.
Yeah.
Like,
Well, it's crazy what you hear, and like I said, hopefully a lot of it is just the rumor mill and things that aren't true. But I know it happens some, so which is sad. But man, it's crazy. It's crazy the ideas these people come up with, which is exactly like I said why I was glad to have you on, because there's so much in the lifting world or the gym world or physique world, we call it bro science versus evidence based science. It's amazing the bro science that's out there. It's amazing the thought process some people go through, and that's related to everything. Whether not just strength training, but nutrition and sport specific training and everything in the whole realm and the whole world around it. So it kind of blows my mind how wacky some of these ideas are.
Yeah. So one thing I'll say about like bro science when it comes to lifting is I think I used to be a lot more anti bro science than I am now. Um, so I'm still opposed to it for like epistemological reasons. Like one of the things that grinds my gears more than anything else is like when people believe something too strongly with insufficient evidence. Like it bothers me more than it should. So like I still have that issue with it, but a lot of the bro science in the lifting community is mostly just like tradition that's been passed down. And for the most part, the stuff that isn't true also isn't that harmful. So like if people believed it, they'd still probably be okay, but maybe just be a little bit more neurotic than they would need to be. So like for example, in bodybuilding, there's this myth that leading up to a show for like the last 3 or 4 weeks, for protein, you should only eat fish, ideally tilapia, because it will,
skin.
yeah, it'll thin the skin. And so the thing is, like, that's probably not true. There's no evidence that it is true. But I mean, tilapia is a very lean source of protein, which is probably going to be like 60% of your diet when you're 2 or 3 weeks out from a show. And so if someone does believe that tilapia is going to thin the skin and they switch over to that as their primary protein source for their last 2 or 3 weeks before the stage, like, did they do something they didn't need to do? Well, yeah, but did it hurt them? No, probably not, unless they're like allergic to fish. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Um,
And I agree with you. Like I said, I don't mean to pick on the bros, because I do think a lot of the stuff that gets tested, comes from the bros. Eventually, that you have to kind of put a hypothesis in place, and then see if it works. And where do those hypotheses come from? A lot of times it's the guys that are actually, they think they've had anecdotal results, and they somehow get tested on the back end. So there's definitely a time and a place for it. I'm not going to knock all the bros by any means.
yeah, I worry more when something isn't just wrong, but is also potentially harmful. So, like, for example, there's a ton of like charlatans in the fitness industry that like other evidence-based people call out all the time. But then like you look at their stuff and it's like kind of dumb, but like if people did it, they'd be fine for the most part. But then the type of person that really gets under my skin is someone like Dave Asprey, who's telling people like, hey, first thing when you wake up in the morning, make yourself coffee with like 700 calories worth of saturated fat dissolved in it. And then also, you want to minimize how much exercise you do. And in fact, you should wear it as a badge of pride if you can get down to like a reasonably healthy weight doing as little exercise as possible. And it's like, no, like, one, there's direct evidence that like adding that much coconut oil to your coffee has pretty bad effects on your blood lipids. So like probably not great for long-term heart health, potentially harmful, and really no, like that's not going to help you with anything, the bulletproof coffee stuff. And then like telling people to exercise less, like that's only potentially good advice if you're talking about someone who, like, so there's some evidence looking at like longevity that like moderate exercisers tend to have better long-term health effects than people who like do a ton of like very, very strenuous exercise. So, if you're telling someone who's like a mid-level marathon runner who trains like they're a world-class marathon runner, like, hey, dude, you're never going to run that 2-hour marathon. Like, just train a little bit less and it'll probably be better for you in the long term. Like, that's probably not bad advice. But like Dave Asprey's telling like IT workers and desk jockeys. Like, hey, you really want to try to get away with as little exercise as possible. It's like, no, like that's potentially harmful advice. So like stuff like that really, really bothers me. But if someone's like, tilapia is going to thin the skin, like, I don't know. I don't lose sleep over that.
Well, there's a lot of that out there though, and it's hard to pick on one or two guys because there's so much. I put on my Instagram story not too long ago. I was at home, was getting ready to go train, and my wife had left TV on, and Dr. Oz was on, which is like my least favorite TV show ever. But that's a story. That's a story for another day. They brought an expert in this day. Granted, this is what it says on TV. They brought an expert in to determine if chicken nuggets are really chicken. That was the topic of the segment. Are chicken nuggets really chicken? And they would go out and ask people in the streets, like, "Hey, do you think chicken nuggets are chicken?" And you get some people like, "Well, yeah, it's a chicken. What part of the chicken is?" It's just like, I'm like, how is this a show? Like, how is this what people think? But it shows you how susceptible people are to just, if a personality puts something out there, there's going to be some people that believe it without giving any second thought to it.
Yeah. No, that's true. Every day that goes by, I try to forget that Dr. Oz exists, and you just brought back all of those memories. So thank you for
I've got
that.
a screenshot somewhere. I'll have to send it to you. But yeah, is our chicken nuggets really chicken? Like, oh, holy cow! But yeah,
God.
it was amazing. It's the worst. It's the absolute worst. We need to get back on sometime and have another show just chatting about Dr. Oz. But anyway, moving on from him.
Just an hour of straight dunking on Dr. Oz. I'd be totally down for that.
All right, we'll book that because I'm game. But hey, there's another topic I wanted to talk about, and it's something that you've kind of mentioned a couple times. You said, "Hey, I'm a 5'9" white guy with these type of genetics," and man, I agree with you. I know exactly where you're coming from because I say I'm 5'11", but I'm really in the 5'10" and a half range, maybe, and I've got some of those same genetics you've got. But there was a study that came out, and you guys reviewed it in mass, I think earlier this year, just a couple of months ago, 2-3 months ago, and it was genetics-based expectations, how they affect your physiology, and I thought that was really interesting. And like I told you earlier in the show, I've read a number of psychology books just because it interests me, and I had actually read that before, but I'd love to hear you kind of expand on that and kind of go into a little more detail, and just talk about how expectations can change maybe our genetic limit, I guess, or our genetic ceiling possibly.
Yeah, so that particular study, they were looking at two specific genes. One of them is called CREB1 and one of them is called FTO. CREB1 is implicated in aerobic exercise performance and thermoregulation, and FTO is the single gene most associated with obesity risk. And when I say most associated with, it's still a relatively weak association, but it's the strongest like single gene candidate that we have.
Right. Yeah.
So do with that what you will. But it's most directly implicated in hunger and satiety, and that's kind of its link to obesity risk. And so what they did in this study is they recruited two pretty large cohorts of people, like 200 plus folks per cohort, if memory serves. They took a blood sample and sent it off to a lab to test for each one of those genes. So in one study, they tested for the CREB gene, and in the other one, they tested for FTO. There is one allele variant of each one of those genes that's like the quote unquote good version. And then there's another one that's the quote unquote bad version. And so you can either be homozygous, meaning you have two copies of the good one. You can be homozygous for the bad one, or you can be heterozygous, meaning you have like one good copy and one bad copy. So they sent it off to the lab. They got the results back. They knew which ones of the subjects had like the good versions and the bad versions of each gene. And then what they did is before they told them their genetic results for the CREB1 study, they had people do an aerobic exercise test. I believe it was like a cycling thing to fatigue. And for the FTO gene study, they did a feeding study. So they fed people a standardized meal, and then took a blood draw to look at a couple hormone levels, and then also just subjective ratings of hunger and satiety. And then a couple weeks later, they theoretically told them the results of their gene test, except they just like divvied it up randomly. So they told half of the people that they had the good version of either the Krebs gene or the FTO gene, and they told half of the people they had the bad version of either the Krebs gene or the FTO gene, but it was randomly assigned. So there were people who had the good version of the Krebs gene who they said had the bad version. There were people who had the bad version that they said had the good version, etc. And then they had them do those same tests again. So for the Krebs 1 study, had them do the same aerobic exercise test. For the FTO study, they had them do the same controlled feeding experiment. And what they found is that pretty much across the board, folks in the Krebs 1 study who they said had the bad version of the Krebs 1 gene, they said they felt more overheated during their second test after they thought they had the bad version of the gene. Their time to fatigue was a little bit less. I should have reread the study before I came on here.
No, I mean, I think well, you're nail. I mean, I think you're nailing it. Yeah.
They looked at like gas exchange, so like essentially respiratory exchange ratio. So that's indicative of like substrate utilization. And basically, the folks who they said had the good version, they improved on those measures, and the folks who they said had the bad version, they got worse on those measures from the test they did 2 weeks prior to the test they did after they theoretically found out the results. Similar pattern of results for the FTO study as well. So the people who they said had the good version, they after the meal, they said they felt fuller, they had greater satiety. They looked at a hormone called acylated ghrelin, which is associated with hunger. So it was lower in the second session than the first session in the people that they said had the good version, and opposite results for the people that they said had the bad version of the FTO gene. And then they also did an analysis to see whether like genetic expectations mattered more than the actual genes people had. So like they did have test results. They knew who did have the good and bad versions of each of these genes. And for several of the measures, and it's been like 3 months since I read this study, so I don't remember exactly which ones, but for about half of the measures in both of the studies, thinking you had the good or bad version of the gene was actually more predictive of having a good or bad response than actually having the good or bad version of the gene. So like the expectancy effect had a larger impact than the actual genotype of the people. And so like that sounds kind of wild, but it's actually not inconsistent with past research. So there was a study from like 2013, 2014, fairly recent, where they, instead of manipulating people's expectations based on genotype, they manipulated people's expectations based on labeling. So they gave people a milkshake. I forget exactly how many calories were in the milkshake, but it was somewhere around 400, give or take. And half of the people, they gave a milkshake with a label that said like, oh, this is a healthy alternative. It's low sugar, low fat, blah, blah, blah. Like you can drink it guilt-free. And it said on the label that it was 200 calories, even though it was a 400 calorie milkshake. They gave another group of people the exact same milkshake, but they said like, oh, this is like super rich and indulgent, like, you know, ton of calories, but my God, it's going to be good, totally worth it. And they labeled it as having 600 calories. So like both groups had the exact same milkshake, and just the labeling was different. And they used the labeling to manipulate expectancy. And they looked at a lot of the same things. So they looked at hunger, fullness, satiety, ghrelin, again, like a hunger hormone, and all of those things. And I believe GLP-1 as well, which is a gut hormone that's also associated with hunger. And in that study, very, very similar results. So you would kind of expect the subjective like the subjective stuff to be affected by expectancy effects. Like, oh, you think you ate more, so of course you feel a little more full, a little bit greater satiety. But it wasn't just those things that were different. The actual like hormones as well, like the ghrelin levels and the GLP-1 levels, those were also impacted by the expectancy effect caused by the different labeling of milkshakes. And it actually goes even further back. So there was a study by Ariel and colleagues published in the 70s. And this is, I think, one of the coolest studies ever. So they took a group of people who were already reasonably well trained in the gym. So I want to say their average 1 rep max squat was around like 365, and average bench was like 250, 260. So, not like elite power lifters, but like
It's
reasonably well
trained.
dudes.
Yeah.
And so pre-training, they had them do squat, bench, standing overhead press, and seated overhead press, because the researchers know how important jack shoulders are. And then they had them train for 7 weeks. And during those 7 weeks, they said, the ones of you that make the best progress, we're going to give free steroids to. So like they were giving them an incentive to train as hard as possible to, get free juice at the end of it. Then after those 7 weeks, they took a sample of the original cohort that were not the ones that made the best progress. Like they just told them that. They took a random sample from the original cohort, and gave them saccharin pills that they said were D-ball. I believe it was D-ball, but told them that they were steroids. But it was just a straight up placebo pill.
Yeah.
And then they had them train for just another 4 weeks thinking they were taking steroids. And so during the first 7 weeks of training, they put an average of like 45 pounds across those 4 lifts. So like 10 to 12 pounds per lift. And then during the second 4 weeks, when they thought they were taking steroids, they put 100 pounds across those 4 lifts. So like the gains were more than twice as large in basically half the time frame. So like the rate of progress was like 7-fold greater.
So saccharin. So we need to all start taking saccharin is the key takeaway, right?
Sure, but yeah. So it's the exact same kind of thing. So like the training wasn't different. Like it was a random sample of the same cohort. So like that shouldn't have really affected things too much. Like the only thing being manipulated was the expectancy. Like, do you think you're taking steroids or not? So I think people could definitely extrapolate too much from that information. So I've seen the hot take many times of like, oh, genetics don't matter. It's all in your head, bro. And like, no, that's bullshit. Like you can't think yourself into being the next Usain Bolt. So like genetics clearly matter, but I do think a pretty clear takeaway is that there are real quantifiable effects of self-limiting beliefs. I think when a lot of people think about self-limiting beliefs, their assumption is just like, oh, if people have self-limiting beliefs, they'll just be less motivated and that could affect things. But like we see that expectancy effects actually have like tangible, measurable effects on physiology. And so I think essentially genetics clearly matter and they matter a ton. But if you personally want to get the most out of your training possible, you probably need to go into it with pretty high expectations, assume that you're gifted for whatever you're doing. And then like, if you're not, you'll find that out. But if you are gifted and you have self-limiting beliefs, I think that can like very tangibly hold you back from achieving what you otherwise could have achieved.
Yeah, man, interesting study. Really interesting. I read a book. I can't remember which book it was, but it had a similar story, and it wasn't a scientific research paper, but it was a story in a book about a group of hotel maids, and you may be familiar with it, and you probably know more details about it than I do. Where they took a group of hotel maids, and they polled them. They said, "Hey, do you think your work is exercise?" And most of them said, no, I'm vacuuming, I'm cleaning, I'm wiping windows, I'm doing. So they would be physically active, physically active over the course of their job for 8 to 10 hours a day, even though they
Yeah.
weren't going into a gym. And they came back and they told half of them, hey, we've determined that your level of activity is a very good level of exercise. And they told the other group that, no, this is not exercise. You're not really exercising unless you're, dedicating time in a gym or on a treadmill or running or doing whatever. And then they go back and they check them, I think it's 6 or 8 weeks later. And the group that they told who their job is, performing high level activity, is acting as exercise, they were in much better shape, and like they had lost weight and they had more energy because they thought they were exercising, and they're doing the same job they'd always done, which is an active job. Don't get me wrong, but the people that viewed their work as exercise got a lot more benefit out of it than the group that didn't think so.
So I've heard of that study. So I will volunteer this. I read psychology papers when they are like directly relevant to exercise and like occasionally diet. Um, so I haven't directly read that study. There's a guy I'm friends with on Facebook. His last name is Coyne, Coyne, maybe like James Coyne or Jerry Coyne, something like that. I remember him posting something, and he's like a PhD in psychology, like legit dude. I remember him posting an article a while back, basically saying that study was junk science. I think because if memory serves, his critique was that in that study they had a really really big sample. So if there were even like small differences, they'd probably be statistically significant.
Mm-hmm.
And they took like 30 different health measures. They looked at weight, but they also looked at like every conceivable like blood lipid particle. They looked at like every variable associated with blood pressure, like several like stress batteries and like a bunch of other stuff. And it was kind of like a classic case of p hacking, if memory serves. So
Yeah.
like they looked at like 40 different measures, and like 3 of them were statistically significant, and then they ran with them and said like, oh well, this is good for these 3 specific very small differences that very well may not exist. So so what I will say is I do think that concept is sound, but I'm not necessarily sure that that's the study you should hang your hat on.
Well, thanks for popping my balloon, Greg. Bringing you on my podcast, I tell one story, and you're
no. The reason I started with that disclaimer is, like I said, that specific type of stuff is not the area of research I follow at all. So I could very well be mistaken about that. Like it could have been that he was talking about like some other very similar study.
I'm not sure, but it is interesting. Like I said, and I thought it kind of lined up with what you guys, wrote about in mass, but, kind of taking the mindset part of it and applying that. Well, hey, what's the correlation? I don't know if it's a 1-to-1 correlation, but I definitely do think there's some evidence out there that, your mindset or your psychology can definitely affect the physiology part of it too.
No, I agree with that. And yes, psychology is weird. Just the whole deal with the replication crisis in psychology, like it's hard to know which studies were designed properly and did actually detect real, like honest to God small effects, and which ones were just kind of like p hack to hell.
Mm-hmm.
And so, yeah, like that very well could be a very legit study with very legit findings that people have just like over scrutinized because of the other problems in the field. Like that very well could be the case as well.
Right. Well, like I said, I don't know. I didn't read the research paper on it. I just read it in a book where that was cited, and that was one of the stories. But I thought it was interesting. And like I said, I just think it's interesting how all this stuff kind of applies, particularly to the group of people who are listening to this who are interested in athletics and sports performance and, changing their body composition. Really cool how that kind of applies and the takeaways that people should kind of bring forth from that. So maybe that's not the best example, but I thought it was an interesting example that kind of went along. But let's kind of get back to some of the sciencey type stuff. I know we've gotten off track a little bit, and that's probably my fault. But there's one more thing one more article out of Mass that I wanted to talk about. And just for everybody listening, I will put links to Mass and Stronger by Science in the podcast in the show notes, so everybody can find that easily and click on Greg's website and social media profiles. But there was one more it's been about a year ago it came out, I believe. It was I think it was about a year ago. That sounds right. And it was lifting, lifting heavy weights required for muscle growth and strength gains. We kind of earlier talked about some of the bro science talks about, you have to lift as heavy as you possibly can. And then I know Brad Schoenfeld's done a lot of research on hypertrophy over different rep ranges, and there's been some different information that's come out over the recent months or years that maybe says, a different number of rep ranges are better for hypertrophy. But again, I'd love to hear kind of what your thoughts are on that. How heavy do you need to lift to gain strength and size versus, what rep ranges should you be in? And just kind of get your thoughts on that whole area.
Yeah, so several thoughts. So first off, there's a question. So the first question is like what is possible, and then the second question is like what is feasible. So to start with, the very strong assumption that most people have is that for a motor unit to grow, so a motor unit is like a motor nerve and all of the muscle fibers that it innervates. The assumption is that for those fibers to grow, they need to be recruited and they need to kind of attain some level of fatigue. So, not necessarily like going out and running a marathon, but like, lifting to the point that you're quite tired and have fatigued most of your muscle fibers in each set, or at least within a workout. The reason I say that that's the very strong assumption is I don't think that's ever actually been proven, that a motor unit needs to be recruited for the fibers associated with it to grow, and that it's not more so due to like local signaling factors. But that is the understanding that most people in the field have, that fiber needs to be recruited and attain at least some level of fatigue in order to hypertrophy. So that being the case, a lot of people have the assumption that you have to train quite heavy for full motor unit recruitment, so you can actually recruit and fatigue all of your fibers. And specifically here, we're talking about the high threshold type 2 motor units, which are going to be the last ones to be recruited and also probably have the most growth potential. So the reason people think that is something called Henneman's size principle. So as the amount of force you need to produce increases, the number of motor units recruited increases as well, up to about 80 to 85% of maximal force output. And then after that point, pretty much all of your motor units are recruited, and further increases in force come about due to what's called rate coding, which is basically the frequency at which each of those motor units is signaled to twitch and contract. So anyway, that's why people think that you need to lift really heavy in order to grow. But what can also happen is if you train with a lighter load, then on rep 1, not all of your motor units are recruited. But as you get closer and closer to fatigue, the initial motor units you recruited, fatigue, are de-recruited, drop out of the recruitment pool. More motor units are recruited to kind of take their place to maintain force output. Then some of those drop out, more get recruited to take their place. And so eventually, by the end of a set, you have recruited either all or virtually all of your motor units and have fatigued all or virtually all of your fibers. So with a heavier weight, you're basically getting pretty much full recruitment from rep 1 carrying that throughout a set until all of those motor units more or less fatigue at around the time of failure. Or with a lighter weight, you're not recruiting all of those motor units from the first rep, but all of them do eventually get recruited and fatigued across the course of the entire set. So that being the case, there is now a very considerable body of research comparing high load versus low load training. So high load being like 70% 1 rep max or higher, and low load being like 50% and below. Comparing those intensity ranges and their effects on hypertrophy. And what we see is that if you do the same number of sets and you take your sets either to failure or very close to failure, you're going to get about the same hypertrophy regardless of what rep range you're training in. There's probably an upper limit. So if you're doing a weight that you can only manage for like doubles or triples, you are recruiting all of those motor units, but you probably don't have time to really fatigue them before you just fail. Like you're only getting like 1 or 2 reps in. And with really, really light loads, so like about 20% of your max or below, the weight just seems to be too light to adequately stimulate all of your fibers. But pretty much between like 30% of your max up to about 80-85% of your max, as long as you're doing sets like to failure or very close to failure, each set is probably worth about the same amount of hypertrophy. And so you don't have to train super heavy to grow. So that is what is possible. But then the question is what's feasible, or maybe what's, and I don't like this word, but it works here, what's optimal. So there's also research, which I don't really think we needed, looking at the general discomfort at training in different rep ranges. And wouldn't you know, most people enjoy doing like sets of 5 to 10 more than they like doing sets of like 30 to 40 to failure. Because like if you've ever done a true like 30 rep max, holy shit, that sucks.
That sounds
like
miserable.
Yeah, and the thing is, like, you do a heavy set of 8. Like, it's hard. You'll need to rest a couple minutes, but you can come back and do another set of 8, and it's fine. And then you rest some more, you do another set of 8, it's fine. Like, you can accumulate a fair amount of volume there. Under lab conditions, when you're probably going to get paid for completing the study, and you have lab techs there, like, encouraging you and like telling you you have to do another set, you can do 6 30 rep maxes back to back to back to back, but boy does it suck. Like, no one wants to do that. And so theoretically, if you're a masochist, you can get the same amount of growth training regardless of rep range. But kind of practically, unless you just really hate yourself, it's probably still going to be more feasible to train more in the traditional hypertrophy range of maybe like 5 or 6 on the low end to maybe 10 to 12 or maybe up to 15 on the high end. Like, so, I think.
So what would the takeaway be from that? But basically train at a rep range you prefer to range, you prefer, and then mix it up occasionally? I mean, is that a good idea?
Yeah, pretty much. And also, like, so yeah, I think like preference is the main thing. I do think there is some benefit to variety. For the higher up stuff, just make sure you're not an idiot about exercise selection. So like if you do want to do some really high rep training, and let's say you want to train your quads, like high rep lunges exist, high rep knee extensions exist. It doesn't have to be 30 rep max squats. I would very strongly encourage it to not be 30 rep max squats. So yeah, like save the really high rep stuff for like body weight stuff or like isolation exercises. Probably don't do that for your heavy compounds, especially stuff with spinal loading.
And so if you're a personal trainer or you're a coach, it would not be a good idea to put your client on their first workout through a 30 rep squat or deadlift.
Well, if they're an annoying client,
yeah,
and you kind of don't want to see them again, like
it's a surefire way to do that.
Yeah, and then they'll come back and say, I'm so sore, like it's not you, it's me. I just don't think I'm going to be working with you anymore. And it's like, oh no, I hate to see you go. Please come back. Anyway, other than like if you're aiming for that scenario and like trying to actively lose business, yeah, that's probably not a great thing to program for people on day one. What I will say though, um, is what that knowledge kind of lets us do is if someone has if someone just has some like not injury but just like general discomfort that is load dependent. So, a lot of people who bench press have a bum shoulder or like a trick elbow. And maybe if they get up over like 60-70% of their max, it starts hurting, but with lighter weights, it's fine. In a situation like that, this research tells us like, hey, you don't have to put them in pain, or you don't have to put them in joint pain. You can just, stick with loads below the threshold where it causes discomfort. They can still get a good workout there. It's gonna burn, like it's gonna be discomfort in the muscle, but like you can stay below the load where it starts causing them joint pain, and they can still get like inadequate stimulus for hypertrophy. So like it gives you some flexibility to train around some stuff that you probably wouldn't be able to if heavy loading was the only tool in your toolbox.
I'm the exact guy you're talking about. So I'm 37, and I rarely do flat bench anymore. I prefer to do dumbbells. It's just easier on my shoulders. It's easier on my body. I prefer it. But whenever I do flat bench, just regular bench, man, once I get to a certain weight, I just feel it in my shoulders. And I don't like doing it, and I've almost taken it completely out. In just using machines and using dumbbells, but I know it would be good probably occasionally to mix that back in. I should probably just use a lighter weight, something that, like I said, causes muscle discomfort, but not joint discomfort.
Yeah, for sure.
I think that's a lot of information for people to take in, but it's very encouraging to think that you don't just have to go and lift 315 pounds for sets of 4, or you don't have to go so heavy on the squat that you're going to throw up every time. You can change it up and mix it up and still be able to get decent results over a wider rep range. So that's encouraging, I think.
Yeah, I mean, like ultimately, like if you're training for strength or if you're training for power output or some other like variable of athletic performance, like then the actual training variables you're working with matter more. But when it comes to training for size, like, dude, your muscles are dumb as shit. Like, as long as you train them hard, like, get them pretty close to failure each set and do, like, a pretty decent number of sets, like, per muscle, per workout, you'll be fine. Like, training for hypertrophy is, I think it takes more effort, like in terms of sweat equity, than pretty much any other training adaptation you may want to train for, except like maybe aerobic endurance, because then you're talking about putting in hundreds of miles a week. But like in terms of stuff you'd be doing in the weight room, I think training for muscle growth takes the most effort physically, but probably takes the least effort mentally. Like it is very forgiving in terms of the range of training variables that can work, as long as the training itself is hard and of adequate volume.
I love that. That's a really good quote and really good thought. And with that thought, we'll probably kind of wrap this episode up. Like I said, I appreciate you being on. We've kind of talked a little bit longer than I planned to, but I thought we had a great conversation. I know when I was going over your stuff in the intro and I talked about Stronger by Science and I talked about mass, I'm sure I left something out. I know you've written a couple books, which I've actually bought both of those as well. I actually just bought them last week, so I haven't been through those yet. I've been catching up on some other reading, but I plan on getting them soon. So for the people that are wanting to learn more about you and learn more of your work, if you don't mind just telling us, where they can find you or what you have going on in the future, I'm sure they'd love to hear about it.
So you can find my writing at strongerbyscience.com. If you want to just follow me generally, I'm probably most active on Facebook, and just follow my personal profile. Like I post way more on there than the business account. Starting to do more stuff with Instagram, but that's less like targeted fitness stuff and more just kind of like stuff I cook or like pictures of my dog and like occasional training videos. So yeah, those are probably the places I'm the most active. So yeah.
Well, I will link all of them below. Like I said, I will definitely link to Mast, so people can check that out. I'll link to Stronger by Science, and I'll put your social media accounts on there as well. But Greg, once again, just want to say thanks, for what you do. Like I said, I think it's phenomenal. Honestly, I think one of a podcast or a show you were on not too long ago, I think you kind of quoted as saying just trying to make science cool again, and I think you're definitely accomplishing that. You and a few other guys like Jeff Nippard and some other people who are kind of in your space are making the science part of fitness and strength training. You're making it fun, you're making it interesting, and you're making it available for people to consume. And definitely appreciate that. Like I said, you're putting a lot of great information out there. Please continue to do so. And man, thanks again for coming on. Really enjoyed the show. I learned a lot. I'm gonna have next time we talk about Dr. Oz, though, I'm gonna have to check all my references before we get on, because you've got all this stuff down to a science. I feel like you got it memorized. So before our Dr. Oz reunion, I'm gonna double check on a few things.
Sounds good, man. And thanks so much for having me on.
Thanks, Greg. We really appreciate it.
Thanks for listening to the Train with Zan podcast,
where our goal is to help you look, feel, and perform like an athlete.
Be sure to subscribe wherever you're listening and follow Zan on Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube.
The training doesn't have to stop here. For today's show notes and more information about training, nutrition, and fitness,
head on over to trainwithzan.com and join the team.